Have you ever considered how hard it would be to disappear without a trace? Most people haven't. Before the technical revolution, it was incredibly simple. If you wanted to leave your life behind and simply start over, you could do so by moving up the street, changing your name, and doing virtually nothing else. There was no electronic paper trail. There was barely a real paper trail. And moving was such a difficult task that most would never have considered it. Moving to a new town meant surrounding yourself with almost entirely new people. People who would have no way of knowing who you were or what you had done. All you would have to do is lie, and you could be someone else. Changing your life was the easiest thing in the world. You just had to do it. The same went for people who wanted to make others vanish. As long as there was no one there to witness the crime, chances were great that if you wanted to make someone disappear, you could. Without DNA, security cameras, or basic crime scene investigation technology, you just needed to seem like a good person, and you'd be in the clear. Doing it today is a whole nother story. With the dawn of social media, Ring doorbell cameras, and the accessibility of phone cameras, it is borderline impossible for you to exist in the modern world without being known in some way. If you drive to the store to pick up some eggs, you are probably caught by 10 security cameras. If you wanted to take a drive to get your mind off of things, your phone, even when turned off, can still track your location, sending it to your friends and family. And if you wanted to leave everything behind, empty your bank accounts, and live off the grid, satellites could still track your movements and the government would still have your records on file. Going missing, vanishing off of the face of the earth, in the era of social media, is something that is borderline impossible. So how is it that on April 22nd, 2020, a U.S. Army soldier stationed in Fort Hood vanished while on the job, in a facility filled with security cameras, never to be seen again? And why did it take the military so long to begin to investigate? Welcome back to another episode of Dreading, brought to you in part by our patrons. Today we are covering the disappearance of Vanessa Guillen on the Fort Hood military base, which was requested by a number of our subscribers. With all that being said, let us begin. So often in true crime cases, people describe the victim as being someone who made the world better, someone who lit up the room with their smile, and someone who deserved the world and more. And Vanessa was no exception. Vanessa was one of 5 siblings, born to her parents, Rogelio and Gloria Guillén. They had migrated from Mexico to Texas prior to Vanessa's birth, and had instilled a fierce patriotism in Vanessa that manifested in her want to join the military as a child. She wanted above all to protect the country that she called home, and she was determined to find a way to do that. In order to pursue her dream, Vanessa made it a point to be as strong as she was kind, running marathons and working out every time she could. She would have her siblings and later her fiancé sit on her shoulders while she did squats and worked out. She was constantly raising the bar for herself, knowing that if she wanted to be the best, she would have to work for it. Despite her focus on her dreams, Vanessa always had time for her family and friends, and people always seemed to gravitate to her. Her laugh was infectious, and she was known to laugh at almost anything, which did wonders to ease people's tensions. When Vanessa, at 18, went to her first day of military training, another recruit recalled feeling nervous. He was an introvert who was surrounded entirely by strangers, and was beginning to think he had made a mistake. Vanessa stood next to him, and in his nervousness, he made a smart remark under his breath, thinking that no one could hear. At once, Vanessa erupted in laughter, telling him that he was hilarious, and the pair became friends. Stories like that, where Vanessa would effortlessly reassure and help people around her, were not rare or uncommon, and hundreds are posted to the Facebook page that was used during the search for Vanessa. Vanessa also loved the military, and she loved being a soldier. Her sister described the first time Vanessa had returned home from training as being the happiest time in her life, and that she seemed to be glowing. Everything that she had worked for since she was a child had come to pass, and she felt like she was on the right track. Her mother also recalled how happy and carefree she was, talking about how joining the military had been everything she had hoped it would be and more. After she had finished basic training, Vanessa had been stationed at Fort Hood in Guillén, Texas, which was only a 3-hour drive away from her family in Houston. For Vanessa, this was her ideal situation. She was incredibly close to her family, and feared that she would have been separated from them and stationed across the country. But instead, she would be able to drive home whenever she wanted, which for Vanessa meant coming home every weekend. But as time would pass, though, the happiness that Vanessa felt started to drain away, and by April of 2020, it would be gone completely. Before we go into detail about what happened at Fort Hood to Vanessa, we have to talk about Fort Hood itself, where she was stationed. Usually the location of the crimes are not vitally important to the case themselves. However, it is absolutely crucial that you understand what Fort Hood is like and how this seemingly normal military base functions. When most people think of military bases, they think of highly guarded, incredibly well-kept spaces, with thousands of military personnel keeping it safe. But in the case of Fort Hood, that couldn't be further from the truth. Fort Hood has been the location of not one, but two mass shootings, both done by military personnel who were stationed there. The first was done in 2009 by Major Nidal Hassan, who worked at the base as a psychiatrist. While military officials would testify in court that Nidal hadn't shown any signs of contempt or anger towards the base, and that his behavior leading up to the shooting didn't raise alarm bells, people who knew and worked with Hassan stated otherwise. In fact, his own patients at the base would go on to record as saying that they had warned higher-ups he would do something like this, and they simply hadn't listened. Hassan was described as an uncomfortable and angry person who was often seen on his own. At various points in his military career, others often tried to befriend him to no avail. He was a heavily guarded man who would only become more withdrawn following the passing of his parents. Nidal worked as a psychiatrist on base and would provide counseling to other soldiers who would describe him as uncomfortable and detached. The advice he would give them often struck them as weird, and at times, when going over their military history, Nidal would get upset with them when they spoke about things they had done or had witnessed while deployed. Other psychiatrists on the base would describe him as disconnected, aloof, paranoid, and at times belligerent and a schizoid. Complaints were made about his behavior early on, with multiple colleagues questioning if he was even fit for the position, and stating that they were concerned for his mental well-being. On numerous occasions, his mental well-being was called into question, but each time it was, higher-ups at the base would hand-wave the concerns without much care. As time went on, Hassan's actions would continue to become more and more alarming, as he started to become more radicalized. It seemed that Fort Hood officials remained purposely ignorant towards Hassan's continued actions. Even when he became belligerent, stating that his clients would be prosecuted for war crimes, officials did nothing to reprimand him, or even note that his behavior was alarming. Hassan's attack on the base left 13 people dead, and was touted as one of the worst attacks on American soil since 9/11. Hassan admitted to his crimes and was sentenced to death shortly after. Military officials and representatives spoke about how Hassan's actions would lead to real, lasting change in the base, and how they would be more vigilant towards the mental health and needs of their soldiers, that making sure that nothing like this happened again would become their biggest priority. However, that was clearly not the case, as only 5 years later, another mass shooting would take place in Fort Hood, again done by another soldier who showed obvious signs of mental anguish. Ivan Lopez was an army specialist who had come back from a tour of Iraq, where he was involved in a roadside bombing. Though he was outside of the blast radius when the bomb went off and was uninjured, this tour left him struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and major depression. He had been undergoing regular treatment on the base, and at times tried to minimize his mental health struggles, because other soldiers in his unit would taunt and bully him. He complained multiple times about the intense hazing he went through on the base, but each time he talked about it, he was told to suck it up. 5 months prior to the shooting, both Lopez's mother and grandfather had passed away in very quick succession. The military had failed to give Lopez appropriate time off, giving him only 2 days to go to the funeral in Puerto Rico and come back. Lopez felt like this was disrespectful, and also felt as if he wasn't able to properly grieve the loss of his family, because once again, other soldiers in his unit would harass him, calling him weak and pathetic for crying. Because of the ongoing harassment he was facing, as well as his mental health worsening, Lopez had asked for a transfer to a new base. He had previously been assigned at Fort Bliss, as well as Fort Leonard Wood, and had done well there, but Fort Hood had a completely different atmosphere, and felt like a black hole. He described any good feeling he had being snuffed out the moment he stepped on base, and wanting to hurt himself multiple times over. On April 2nd, 2014, Lopez went back to the base to ask for a 10-day leave form so he could properly move his wife and 4 kids into his new apartment, seeing as their previous one had been burglarized. He also planned to use this time off as a much-needed period to grieve his mother and grandfather, and try to relax after weeks of torment from his fellow soldiers. However, he was told by the officers in the administration office that he would have to come back to retrieve it, as they didn't have any on hand. Lopez and the officers went back and forth in a semi-heated exchange, until finally the request was outright denied, with an official in the office stating that because he had already secured housing in Guillén, outside of Fort Hood, they didn't need to give him time off for moving. For Lopez, this felt like another smack in the face by the base that treated him like garbage. He was already dealing with PTSD and depression from his time in Iraq. He felt like he'd been bullied and picked on by every other soldier he had met on that base, and when his mother died, he was only given 2 days off to mourn. It didn't matter how polite the officer telling him his time off wouldn't be approved. To Lopez, it all sounded the same. Ivan went outside briefly and smoked a cigarette, trying to calm down. He then went to his car, pulled out his gun, and stormed into the building, shooting everyone he came into contact with, and only stopped to shoot himself when he realized that there was no way he would be getting out of the building alive. The military officials stated that Lopez's actions could not have been anticipated, and that there were virtually no warning signs to what he had done. Multiple other soldiers who were stationed at Fort Hood spoke out about what it was really like to be stationed there, and how terrible the base was, like in this interview with CNN.
So I'm sitting in the car with someone who's stationed here at Fort Hood. We're not going to say who she is, what she does, but what is it like on post right now?
It's a pretty chaotic state. This place, they call it the Great Place. At the end of the day, it's really not the Great Place. People just hear things that go on, but they really don't understand that this place is definitely a black hole. This place is a stressful place, and we don't have as much as attention as we should. People are just saying, oh yeah, this is just another massacre, and they're going to forget about it, and it's not going to be in everybody's mind. Until we have people step up and see, hey, there needs to be change here, we're going to continue to have incidents like this. And at the end of the day, that's a sad realization that, we're going to have to come to.
You were saying to me when we were talking before, you've only been here a number of months, right, and you don't want to be here anymore. You want to go back to basic training because it's that bad. What about Fort Hood is that bad?
It's between leadership, just the quality of life. Like, it's people in jail have a better life than a lot of these soldiers here. And if you don't have a family and you're a single soldier living in the barracks, it can be miserable. And we have a lot of people in behavioral health, and nobody really understands how bad somebody's mental stability is, or how hard it is to keep your sanity here being at Fort Hood.
You're almost shaking talking to me. Why?
It's just that frustrating being here. We have our big leaders, Pentagon or whatever. They're, oh yeah, our soldiers ready to take pay cuts. We need to focus on our equipment and all this. No, they really should be focused on our quality of life, because right now it's not up to par. And we're going to keep having situations like this unless, our government steps in. Hey, look, we need to take care of our troops, our soldiers, and their families.
Take care how?
I mean, offer more things like, people say, oh, they have PTSD, they're going to blame it on this. PTSD is a serious thing. People don't give, the mental challenges that people face enough credit. Like, it can change you. Like, I have a disabled vet, mom who has PTSD, and she's not the same person that she was when I was younger from being deployed, because she doesn't get the proper attention she needs. So if we sit there and fix the underlying problem of, people saying they have these mental disabilities, our quality of life would be better. Or the fact that, we have to do crazy things. We lose our sanity knowing that we don't get paid enough to work as much as we do. I could flip burgers right now and make more money.
You described Fort Hood as this black hole. You said you don't blame this 34-year-old shooter for doing what he did.
As awful as that sounds, I at the end of the day, I can't be mad at him. I blame his command. I blame the people not giving him that help that he needed. I'm more than sure he reached out to people. And I pray for all those families that were affected by this incident. But people just don't understand what it is to have the life that we do here at Hood.
People have said already that the Army was doing everything right. This man was undergoing anxiety and depression treatment. He wasn't having suicidal thoughts. He was on drugs. He was on Ambien. They were monitoring him. What was the Army not doing, in your opinion?
Just because they're saying they're doing these things doesn't mean it necessarily was true. You know, my unit alone, if you go to behavioral health, you're listed as a crazy person, and they will treat you differently than what you would if you were just a normal soldier just sucking it up. Because a lot of people don't get the help because they don't want to be listed as crazy. They don't want to be treated differently.
How are you treated differently if you're listed with any kind of mental issue?
Basically, you're not good enough. You're different. You're crazy. You're crazy. That's the bottom line. Like, you don't deserve to be treated like, oh, this soldier over here that, you know, can perform all these duties without freaking out about something. Well, maybe that soldier didn't endure the same thing another soldier did. And they need to realize that. It's just crazy.
You said suicides are really bad here.
Definitely. And that's something that people are overlooking. They think it's just like, oh, those people are being selfish. No, they're not being selfish. They're reaching out. They're showing signs, and nobody's just making the effort to do something about it. And sometimes you have to figure out that's just life. You can't change it no matter what you want to do. I mean, if you want to try to get out, they're going to give you hell. It's not going to be easy. And you're going to end up screwing yourself because you're going to be left with nothing. You're not going to have, you know, the benefits to take care of you. So who's to say you're going to make it on the outside world either? So it's a harsh reality knowing that either way, you're going to be stressed out. You're going to be unhappy. And it sucks that you have to live every day regretting joining something that you thought would have been good. Something that, and don't get me wrong, it's not like this at every post. It's not. I'm a military brat, and I've loved the places I've gone to. It just doesn't make any sense how Fort Hood and its soldier and families are treated.
Interviews like this one, where soldiers spoke anonymously about the situation in Fort Hood and not being surprised or blaming the shooter for what they had done, slowly began to come out. With more and more people opening up about what a terrible place it was, they spoke about sexual harassment, abuse, and higher-ups at the base, purposely turning a blind eye to all of it, not wanting to write official reports as to not alert anyone to the problems on the base. Other soldiers spoke out about how they had been stationed in other places around the country without issue, only to fall into a major depression at Fort Hood. Less than 2 months after the shooting, another scandal hit the base, when a rape prevention officer, Sergeant First Class Gregory McQueen, was caught running an on-base prostitution ring, purposely targeting financially strapped female recruits to have sex with higher-ranking military officials for money. Sergeant McQueen worked with a task force that was created to combat the incredibly high numbers of sexual assault cases that were happening on the base, and provide victims, both male and female, with aftercare. Instead, McQueen used the program to target young women he deemed attractive enough to join his prostitution ring, and deliberately used information about their assaults to gain their confidence and, at times, blackmail them. He would present himself as someone who wanted nothing more than to help them after what they had been through. He positioned himself in their lives as a confidant who would work hard to get them justice. Once he got to know the victims and learned more about their lives, he would use that information he had on them to perfectly pitch the idea of them working as a prostitute to earn extra money. In one case, a 20-year-old woman who had been assaulted on the base, spoke to him about how she was struggling to make ends meet as a single mother. Because she was a fairly new soldier, she wasn't making enough money to support herself or her child, which was the reason she joined the military in the first place. She was considering leaving the army to get a job off base, but McQueen told her that he could help her, and then informed her that high-ranking military officials would pay upwards of $100 a night to sleep with her, and he'd be more than happy to arrange it for her if she wanted. He brought up how if she were to leave the military, she would lose access to her health care, child care, as well as her housing, which was something she couldn't afford. He had been a used car salesman before joining the military, and the way he pitched joining his prostitution ring made it seem like an obvious, easy fix to the women who he was charged to care for after they had been assaulted. After she agreed, McQueen took photos of her in the shower to be used as blackmail on the off chance she came forward about what he was doing, and had sex with her to see how she would act with other clients. He told her he needed to make sure she was good enough in bed to be worth the money. McQueen did this with other women as well, all of whom he met through the rape prevention program. Multiple women denied McQueen, however. He very rarely took no for an answer. He would continue to pressure these women for weeks and had, in some cases, blackmailed them with photos he had taken without their knowledge, and it seemed that nothing was off limits, as long as he got what he wanted. McQueen, for his part, admitted to doing this and when in court, apologized for putting a smudge on an army that was trying to lower its rates of sexual assault through the program he was affiliated with. In response, the military court sentenced him to 2 years in prison and reduced his rank before discharging him dishonorably. However, when he was released, the military apparently hadn't put his crimes on his record, as he and his wife were then allowed to join the foster care program and try to foster children. It was only when this oversight was made public that the military finally took action. Despite multiple women coming forward and Sergeant McQueen admitting to charging high-ranking military officers to sleep with these young women, only one other person was named as having used his service, that being Sergeant Brad Grimes. In response to paying to sleep with female soldiers, Grimes was simply reprimanded and demoted. According to his LinkedIn profile, he is still at Fort Hood working as a military advisor. Obviously, more high-ranking military officials had used Sergeant McQueen's service, but they have never been named publicly. We know for a fact that at least 3 women were a part of this ring, and it had carried on for at least a year when it was made public. So the very implication that only one man ever used it is insulting to the public's collective intelligence. However, the reporting on this is shockingly minimal, with one of the only on-air news reports discussing it being from Dr. Drew. Fort Hood gained a reputation for being one of the worst, if not the worst, Army base in the United States. It was viewed as a death trap for many of its soldiers, with an alarmingly high rate of suicide, sexual assault, and deaths occurring on base every year. And while Vanessa had enjoyed basic training and felt like the Army was where she belonged, after beginning to work at Fort Hood, she quickly became its next victim. About a month or so before her death, Vanessa told her mom that she had been being sexually harassed while on base by another officer. Specifically, she spoke about how she had been taking a shower and a sergeant had walked in on her, refusing to leave. She refused to tell her mom who was behind it, knowing that Gloria would go to the base and cause a scene, but the constant sexual harassment was starting to weigh on her. She was depressed, upset, and felt like she couldn't say anything because the person doing it outranked her. And if she were to speak up, she would be seen as an issue. She stated that this person had had other complaints lodged against them, but they had been dismissed, so lodging a complaint was virtually pointless. Her sisters likewise noted a change in her demeanor, and she had promised them that she would tell them what's wrong when they were older and could understand. Vanessa felt alone, and like there was really nothing she could do besides grin and bear it. On the morning of April 22nd, 2020, Vanessa had been called in to cover a shift at one of the arms rooms on base, where she worked as a small arms and artillery repairman. A few hours into her shift, Vanessa went to verify the serial numbers of some weaponry with Aaron Robinson, who was working in another arms room across base. She texted Aaron to let him know that she was on her way over, and Aaron confirmed that she made the trip, confirmed the serial numbers without so much as speaking to him, and then left to go to the motor pool. 3 eyewitnesses came forward and verified Aaron's story, stating that they had seen her walk towards the motor pool after leaving the arms room. However, Vanessa never made it to the motor pool and was unfortunately never seen or heard from again. But it would take hours for anyone on base to notice she had gone missing. Oddly enough, later in the day, when room checks were done at 4 p.m. to make sure that all soldiers living on the base were present and accounted for, Vanessa was marked as present, despite going missing hours before. This would mark the beginning of an uncomfortable, repeated pattern of false information being given in the military investigation that, at best, confirms the incompetence of the powers that be in Fort Hood, and at worst, alludes to a potential military cover-up that was incredibly poorly executed. Mind you, Vanessa was not the first soldier to go missing on the base. In fact, in the year 2020 alone, 12 soldiers, including Vanessa, had disappeared. So for the investigation to be handled as poorly as it was, comes down to sheer incompetence or blatant malice. It would be hours before the military actually realized that Vanessa had gone missing, and in fact been killed and transported off the base, and it would take pressure from people outside of Fort Hood to actually get them to care. While the military had no idea that Vanessa had gone missing, her family realized it almost immediately. Vanessa was extremely responsive when it came to talking to her family, and when she had not responded to any of their calls or texts that day, they instantly knew something was wrong. Not only that, but she hadn't posted to Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, which was completely unheard of for her. She wasn't the type to go off the grid, and the fact that she wasn't texting them back and hadn't tweeted was completely out of character. After a couple hours of not hearing from Vanessa, her sister, Myra, began to reach out to those at Fort Hood who are also close to Vanessa, only to find that two of her friends had made plans with her to go hiking that day after their shift was over, and she hadn't shown up, which again was completely out of character. Those friends had searched the base for her, including her barracks, but she was nowhere to be found. She was slightly comforted by the fact that her sister had been on shift at the base, though feeling as if, at the very least, they would be able to track her movements from there. Her entire family was under the impression that Fort Hood, being a military base, had security cameras everywhere and was one of the safest places in the country to work. Unbeknownst to her, most of the security cameras on the base didn't even work properly. Myra couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her sister. She began to call the base, asking to speak to someone in charge, and it was relayed to her that no one had physically seen Vanessa since noon that day, more than 6 hours earlier. She continued to press them, asking them what they were doing, who she could talk to get something done, if they were looking for her sister, but they stonewalled her, telling her that Vanessa would turn up, and that it isn't uncommon for soldiers to go missing for a day or two. Myra didn't accept that. In the middle of the night, she drove the 3 hours down to Guillén, Texas, to look for her sister. She arrived at the base at 3 a.m. with Vanessa's fiancé, Juan, tired and upset, only to be told to come back the next morning, as Vanessa's unit commander was sleeping. Frustrated, she left and came back at 8 a.m. and was told that they were doing all they could for the situation, but it appeared to them that Vanessa had gone AWOL. They told her the base had been thoroughly checked over and that all they had been able to find was Vanessa's ID badge, wallet, credit cards, and keys, which had been left in the armory, and Vanessa's car was still parked in the parking lot. The only thing missing was Vanessa herself and her phone. When Myra asked how it would be possible for Vanessa to abandon her post in the middle of the day without being spotted on any security cameras and leave the base without a car, wallet, or keys, they admitted it did seem strange. To Myra, it appeared that they were trying to push her to believe her sister had started a new life elsewhere, and she knew that that was not the case. According to the military, there was no sign of foul play in the base, and nothing seemed suspicious. According to officials at Fort Hood, the base had been fully searched by 3 different groups of people. The first was Vanessa's unit, led by her commanding officer. They had allegedly checked the base the night before. They had retraced her steps and talked to multiple witnesses who said that they saw Vanessa throughout the day. That is where it was relayed to them by 3 separate witnesses outside of her unit that they had seen Vanessa walking towards the motor pool after she had been in the small arms room with Aaron Robinson. The second group to search the base where she had last been seen was the military police, who also searched the areas she was last seen, which included both small arms rooms, the motor pool, and everything in between. After they failed to find any evidence of suspicious activity or foul play, they then turned the case over to the U.S. Criminal Investigation Division. They too failed to find anything on the base that would lead them to believe that something had happened to Vanessa. How thoroughly the base was searched, or if it was in fact searched at all, by any of these groups would become a source of contention in the case, leading most to believe that Fort Hood officials tried to cover their asses and lie in their official reports at best, or purposely covered up evidence of a crime at worst. The idea that the entire base was searched by one group of people who found nothing pointing to foul play is far-fetched enough as it is. The concept that nothing suspicious was found when the entire base was searched by professionals is borderline impossible and will become ridiculous once what happened to Vanessa and where it happened was eventually revealed to the public. The Guillén family was at a loss. Vanessa had been missing for over 24 hours. They could feel that something terrible had happened, and instead of giving them any information or working with them, to try and find out what happened to Vanessa, they were being stonewalled, with the military insisting that no foul play seemed to have happened on the base. It became apparent that the military wasn't going to be helping them, and was instead pushing them to drop it, or at the very least, let them handle it quietly. Myra, who was still in Guillén, refused to accept that. She began a grassroots campaign of her own and urged the public to help her. She posted nonstop on social media, using Twitter to spread the word that her sister had gone missing, and seemingly no one at Fort Hood cared. She made flyers with Vanessa's picture and description, and hung them up everywhere she could, determined to get her face in front of as many people as possible, in the off chance that they knew something. Myra's posts and insistence that something had happened to her sister caught the attention of multiple news stations, and quickly, Vanessa became headline news. The Army was still tight-lipped about their own investigation, insisting that nothing suspicious had occurred on base and were looking into the matter themselves. But Vanessa's disappearance gained more public attention. It became obvious that they would have to do more. The Army sent out a press release about the case, and immediately, people were thrown off by some of the information that was given, as it was different from what they had been told originally. The eyewitness reports that had put Vanessa walking out of the small arms room and towards the motor pool had been thrown out entirely after it was found that they came from people who weren't in Vanessa's unit and weren't familiar with her in the slightest. Those witnesses were questioned a second time and couldn't describe what she had been wearing that day or what she looked like, and it was immediately obvious that none of them had ever actually seen Vanessa, and had blatantly lied at the beginning of the investigation for virtually no reason. Their eyewitness testimony held a hefty amount of weight, as it was used to determine where she had been seen last, what direction she was going, and where she had been kidnapped, but now it had to be thrown out. This information had been given to the CID the night that they were placed on this case, and taken as fact by them. Now, removing those statements from the investigation, they now had to operate from the standpoint that Vanessa had last been seen in the small arms repair room with Aaron Robinson, who they had previously ruled out entirely based solely on the fact that she had been seen walking around the base afterwards. There was never a reason given as to why these three witnesses lied and gave false statements. Online sleuths speculated that these three people knew what had occurred and were trying to help cover up for the crime, while others said it was a simple misunderstanding. But why they weren't thoroughly questioned when they originally gave their statements is once again, at the very least, a sign of the sheer incompetence by the officials at Fort Hood. Despite this taking place at the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, Myra's grassroots campaign to find her sister took off, and the Guillén family began to hold protests outside of the base, demanding answers. Celebrities like Selma Hayek and Baby Bash posted about Vanessa, driving even more publicity to the case. People turned out in droves to protest outside of the gates of Fort Hood, and multiple donors came forward, and offering rewards for information that could help find Vanessa. In response to the protests happening outside of their gates, the Army mobilized multiple searches in the surrounding areas, sending press releases to the media to state that they were taking the matter seriously, and that they were just as keen to find Vanessa as her family was. In response to Vanessa's family saying the military wasn't searching for their sister, they released this photo showcasing a search they had done and pledged to do more. It was during these searches by the military that on June 19th, almost 2 months after Vanessa went missing, that a body was found. However, it wasn't Vanessa. Gregory Morales was 23 years old when he went missing from Fort Hood. According to the people who knew him, he was a happy-go-lucky person whose biggest concern was having fun. He had joined the military to support himself and his new wife, Penny, and was weeks away from being discharged when he suddenly vanished. According to the officials at Fort Hood, he simply stopped showing up for work, and they listed him as AWOL, or absent without leave. His car had been found hours away in Dallas, Texas, seemingly abandoned, leading to the conclusion that he had simply left without telling anyone in his life, even his wife. When this was relayed back to his mother, she knew it wasn't true. Gregory wasn't the kind of person to just up and leave. He loved his family, he loved his work, and he was just days away from being officially discharged. So the very idea that he would vanish without a trace was ridiculous. But despite her protests, the Army listed him as a deserter, stripping him of his rank and refusing to search for him, as they didn't believe he was missing. Gregory's family was in mourning, knowing that something horrible had to have happened to him for him to go missing like this. They knew almost at once that he had died. They lived in Oklahoma and couldn't afford to travel to Texas to search for him themselves. The idea of starting a grassroots campaign and search effort didn't occur to them, as they had never seen it done before. Instead, they had to live with the false sense of hope that maybe he had simply left without notice or reason, and would show back up one day. But on June 19th, 2020, their worst fears were realized. Gregory's skeletal remains were buried in a field outside of the base, and at once the military did an about-face. They admitted that they were wrong to have listed Morales as AWOL without so much as an investigation, and they should have, at the very least, opened a small investigation into his disappearance and subsequent murder. But other than providing a military funeral and reinstating his military rank, they did little to help give the family any closure. To this day, what happened to Gregory Morales is still unknown, with the military keeping every aspect of the investigation close to their chest. Gregory's mother, Kim Weidel, has stated that the military has seemingly moved on from her son and has stopped caring, but she can't. Gregory Morales was a person just like Vanessa, a person who officials at Fort Hood were happy to write off instead of looking for, and a person who deserved to have justice. After Gregory Morales' body was found and the public was made aware of how the military hadn't investigated his disappearance despite his family's protests, it became clear that there was something nefarious at play. People already were having a hard time believing that one person could go missing from a highly secure military base without anyone seeing them. But now that they were made aware of that exact same thing happening before, the case exploded into the media. People began to believe that Fort Hood, or at least the officials there, were covering something up and were completely unwilling to search for their own soldiers. Conspiracy theories began to come out about high-level officials being involved in both Gregory Morales' case and Vanessa's case, and those theories took on a life of their own. Multiple outlets began reporting on the case, and former military personnel who had been stationed at Fort Hood began to speak up about how terrible it had been. Vanessa's mother came forward and spoke about how Vanessa had been followed into the shower by another officer, how she had been sexually harassed repeatedly, and female soldiers corroborated her story, sharing their own experiences in the military. Hashtag I am Vanessa Guillen began to trend, with people bringing attention to the case, while also relaying their personal stories of assault that had happened while in the military. The CID began to work overtime, trying in earnest to find answers so they could close the case and bring an end to the public scrutiny. Two of Vanessa's friends, who she had plans to go hiking with on the day she went missing, were brought in multiple times and questioned. In multiple instances, they were told that they had raped Vanessa, left her body out in the middle of nowhere, and should just admit it. This was, of course, in spite of there being no evidence of this happening. The pair maintained their innocence, as they had simply been friends with Vanessa, and it was clear that the CID were scrambling. The investigation so far had truly produced no leads, and they were hoping that they could pin it on someone and just call it a day. Over a month after the investigation had started, they decided that they would go back to the drawing board. They knew that some of the eyewitness testimony that they had received at the beginning of the search had been inaccurate, and so they threw it all away and began to re-interview the people who had been on the base when Vanessa went missing, retracing Vanessa's last steps in the hopes that something new could be found. Oddly enough, 2 months into the investigation, more was found. As they began to piece together Vanessa's day, everything seemed to check out, up until Vanessa left her station at the small arms room to verify serial numbers with Aaron Robinson. They brought Aaron back in for questioning, who stated that Vanessa had come in, asked him a couple questions, and then immediately left, making her way towards the motor pool, which, while similar to his previous statement, was not the same as what he had said before. He had previously stated that Vanessa hadn't spoken with him at all, which struck the interviewers as weird. Jumping on this slight change, the CID investigators continued to question him, asking him what he did with the rest of his night and if he could properly provide an alibi. Robinson stated that after he left the base, he spent the night at home with his girlfriend, watching movies, which she happily confirmed in her own interview. It seemed as if they had hit the same wall they had hit before. That is until two more witnesses came forward. According to these two previously unknown witnesses, supposedly long after Vanessa had left the arms room herself, Aaron had been seen carrying a large, tuft box through the base into his car. The box itself appeared to be heavy, as Aaron was struggling to carry it. He rejected any help that was offered to him, which struck one of the witnesses as odd. He then placed the large box in his car at the end of his shift and drove off. This immediately raised red flags to the investigators, as Vanessa's petite frame could easily have been placed into a tuft box and transported. With this added information, it became obvious that whatever had happened to Vanessa had clearly happened in the small arms room with Aaron, and it was clear that Vanessa had most likely lost her life. By this time, the arms room had been searched 3 times over, and no evidence had been found. It had also been in use for the month-long period that Vanessa had been missing. However, upon further investigation, the CID found that one hammer had gone missing on the day of Vanessa's disappearance. Robinson himself admitted to his superior officer that he had simply misplaced the hammer that day, and it had been written off as just a coincidence. With the addition of the 2 eyewitnesses and the missing hammer, the investigators began to focus solely on Robinson. He had been the last to see her, he had access to a possible murder weapon, but he had an alibi, as he had spent the night with his girlfriend, which had been confirmed by her. In order to further justify his story, they went back to him the next day and asked if he would consent for them to search his phone, which he ultimately agreed to. Using a universal forensic extraction device, they were able to lift everything off of his phone, even if it had previously been deleted. Things like text messages, calls, search history, and even GPS location data were all lifted from the phone and given to the CID, and it was there that they made multiple discoveries. Despite stating that he had spent the duration of the night hanging out with his girlfriend at home, Robinson's phone told an entirely different story. According to previously deleted cell phone data, he had called his girlfriend, Cecily Aguilar, multiple times over, and his phone had actually pinged in Belton, Texas, a good 17 miles away from his home in the early morning hours of April 23rd. Cecily was then brought in for questioning as well, under the pretense of confirming Aaron's alibi, and when asked about why he had called her so much that morning if they had been together, Cecily tried her best to cover for him. She stated that she had lost her phone multiple times that night, and being a good boyfriend that he was, he had called it in order to help her find it. She was unaware that they had proof that he hadn't been home at all. The police were quick to point out that multiple of the calls lasted for a couple of minutes, meaning that she would have had to have picked up the phone and spoken with him, which made no sense if they were together at home. At which point she changed her story entirely. She stated that she had misremembered what had happened, innocently confusing the day Vanessa went missing for another day, when they had been home together and she lost her phone. She maintained that Aaron and her had been together, but that night they had gone on a long drive, something she usually did to deal with her anxiety. According to her, they had driven all night and laid out under the stars in a random field in Belton, because she was stressed from work and life in general. But again, this led to the police questioning why she would have needed him to call her phone when they were together in the car, and why she would have seemingly forgotten any of this information, especially since Aaron would have already been aware that he was the last to see someone who had gone missing. Forgetting something that happened months ago is normal. However, forgetting details of a night where your boyfriend was the last person to see someone who has gone missing is not. While the CID didn't have anything concrete, it became clear that Aaron had had some part in Vanessa's disappearance. According to military officials, that same day, he was detained by military officers and confined to his room on base. They told him that he was being detained due to breaking the base's COVID protocol, but they really wanted to keep an eye on him in case he tried to run. At the same time they were questioning Cecily and detaining Aaron, they began conducting searches of the area that Aaron's phone had pinged at. Almost at once, they had come across disturbed dirt and what looked to be the burnt remains of a plastic container that matched the description of the tuft box witnesses had seen Robinson with. The soil around the burned site was freshly turned, meaning that something had recently been dug up there. However, there was no sign of Vanessa. It wouldn't be until a little less than a week later when a construction crew not too far from where they had searched would find what was left of Vanessa's remains, mixed with concrete and lime. June 30th, 2020, Vanessa was finally found, and what happened to her would finally be revealed. What happened to Vanessa Guillen is something that to this day, despite the case being closed, is caked in mystery. How Aaron was able to get away with a crime as heinous as this in a military base is completely absurd and raises many questions. But according to the official court documents, this is what happened. When Vanessa had visited the small arms room with Aaron Robinson, he had, seemingly for no reason, attacked Vanessa with a hammer. He hit her multiple times over the head with it, bludgeoning her to death. He then placed her body in a tuft box, which was located in the arms room, and somehow was able to clean the entire room of any evidence that the altercation took place there. Robinson did such a good job cleaning that when the arms room would be searched 3 times in the following night, no blood, brain matter, or evidence of what had occurred was found. He also managed to clean the room of all evidence entirely by himself, without any other soldier coming in or seeing anything suspicious, save for him carrying the tough box after his shift had ended. After he cleaned the arms room, he carried Vanessa's body through the base in the tough box, loaded her into his car, and then picked up his girlfriend from her job at a gas station near the base. And the pair drove to the Leon River in Belmont, Texas, found an isolated area, and began to dismember Vanessa's body. According to Cecily, they used either a hatchet or a samurai sword. She couldn't quite remember which. When they had finished cutting up Vanessa's body, they began to burn her remains, hoping to destroy all evidence that her body had ever even been there. However, they soon realized that burning a body isn't just something that you can simply do. When they tried to burn pieces of Vanessa's body, the flames and smoke grew so high that the pair feared that they were drawing attention to themselves. According to Cecily, the flames were larger than the trees surrounding them, and she claimed they reached 15 feet high. After realizing that burning her body might draw more attention to them, when the flames had died down, the pair opted to bury her dismembered body in 3 separate unmarked holes. That had been where the police had originally found the remnants of the tuft box Vanessa was stored in. However, after a couple of days of Vanessa's body being there, Cecily began to panic, worrying that they hadn't done enough to hide the body, and convinced Aaron that they needed to go back. She had gone onto the Facebook marketplace and found a bag of concrete and some gloves, with the hopes that the purchase couldn't be traced back to her. Then her and Aaron drove back to Belmont, unearthed Vanessa's burnt remains, tried to burn them again, only to find that they had the same issue as before. After, they mixed what was left of Vanessa with concrete, and then buried her body for a second time a bit further away. At that point, Cecily and Aaron went back to their lives as usual, as if nothing had happened. Aaron had told Cecily that 3 eyewitnesses had come forward the day Vanessa had gone missing, and had stated that they had seen her after she had left the small arms room, meaning that he was in the clear for the murder. He told her that eventually the CID would call her in order to justify his story that she had been with him all night, and all she would have to say was yes, and the case would be quietly closed. And it seemed like that might have been the case, had Vanessa's family not come forward to demand answers. Before we go any further, we need to focus on Cecily Aguilar and her role in these crimes. Though Aaron was the one to murder Vanessa, Cecily was clearly a willing participant, and her behavior after the murder shows this. Some reporting after the fact have tried to state that Cecily was an unwilling accomplice and wasn't as responsible for what had occurred. Prior to the murder, Cecily had been married to a man named Guillén Aguilar. Guillén was also stationed at Fort Hood, and it was through him that Cecily met Aaron. Aaron was a friend of Guillén and had moved into the home that the couple had shared, splitting rent with them. However, the relationship between the couple soured, and while under the same roof as her husband, Cecily began to have sex with Aaron. At the time of the murder, Aaron had gotten his own place, and he and Cecily had been seeing each other, officially, for 2 months, of which she had been separated from Guillén. Beyond that, not much is known about Cecily's life, and very few of her friends or family have spoken out publicly about her. While Cecily didn't murder Vanessa herself, she was more than happy to dismember her body and try to cover up her crimes. In fact, it seems that she on some level enjoyed what she had done, because 2 days later she posted the following photos with these captions. "No one can make Oib feel," she means you feel, "inferior without your consent. Hashtag love yourself, self-love, body positivity, feeling myself. The most dangerous woman, if all, is the one who refuses to rely on you to save her, because she was never a damsel in distress. She was born in fire, fierce to melt the iron. You fell in love with a woman who knows how to tame the dragon. She's the Targaryen of her own soul. Hashtag beautiful girls, babes, follow me, thick white girl. I'm your moon goddess. When the moon is waxing, she is the maiden, new, carefree, and full of potential. When the moon is full, she is the mother, caring, nurturing, and loving. When the moon is waning, she is the crone, knowledgeable, wise, and experienced. The triple goddess, neo-paganism, Greek mythology." These are statements talking about being born in fire after she had tried to burn Vanessa's body, and stating that no one can make you feel inferior without your consent when she took part in a murder. The themes of destruction and her being powerful are constant, and indicate some level of joy in what she had done. After Aaron and her had gone back to the dump site, reburnt Vanessa's body, mixed the remains with concrete, and buried them for a second time, she posted the following photos with these captions. I loved her, the dark side of her. Any girl can play innocent, by her demons are what drove me wild. Her secrets, her pain, she masked with laughter. The darkness that she tries so hard to hide, that's what made me fall for her. He showed me her darkest part of him. She said block is my favorite color. What? I will not have you without the darkness that hides within you. I will not let you have me without the madness that makes me. If our demons cannot dance, if our demons cannot dance, neither can we. Her last post, before she was interrogated by the CID for the final time, was this photo, with the caption, people who fight fire with fire end up with the ashes of their own integrity. Cecily was in no way traumatized by the crimes she took part in. She wasn't horrified or scared to be living with or dating a man who had bludgeoned another woman to death. Her posts talking about how she thrives in her own darkness and has never been a damsel in distress shows that. She enjoyed what she had done and thought that in helping him dispose of the body that they were strengthening their relationship. She thought that what they were doing was akin to renewing wedding vows and showing their devotion to one another, and it came at the expense of Vanessa's life. After Vanessa's remains were found, the CID brought Cecily back in to be interrogated. They presented her with all of the evidence, and immediately she cracked. She told them that on April 22nd, Aaron had called her while she was at work and told her that he had bludgeoned a female soldier to death, and he didn't know what to do. He had already gotten the body off of the base and had left the tuft box in the middle of nowhere in Belmont, but he had no idea what to do next. She told him that after work they would go back and they would take care of the situation, and that's exactly what they did. She relayed every detail of what they had done and how they had done it, stating that she just kind of went along for the ride. Despite that, it was clear in the retelling that the burning of the body had been her idea, along with going back after the fact to mix her remains with concrete. To further corroborate the story, the investigators had Aguilar call Aaron, and the two talked about what they had done. The CID listened in as he talked about how he believed that they were onto him. And partway through the phone call, he realized that her body had been found in Belmont. He sent Aguilar photos of news articles that had just come out, and repeatedly said, "Baby, they found the pieces." Robinson had previously been detained on the base. However, much like Vanessa, he had managed to leave without anyone noticing. He had no idea that Cecily had begun to work with the investigation and had turned on him. But it seemed as if he felt the walls were already beginning to close in on him, and quickly made his escape, somehow gaining access to a small gun. How he was able to get off a military base with a weapon after being detained and supposedly watched is unknown, much like why 3 people gave false eyewitness statements that exonerated him. Why 2 eyewitnesses came forward a month into the investigation to point the finger at him, and how he was able to clean the small arms repair room so thoroughly that nothing was found after 3 separate searches. The officials at Fort Hood have never stated nor addressed how this was allowed to happen on their premises. Aaron was found at 12:39 a.m. by police, who noticed that he seemed out of it, stressed, and was walking around shirtless with a gun. When they began to confront him, Aaron put the gun up to his head and, according to the police, shot himself. It should be noted that according to Vanessa's mother, Gloria, there are conflicting reports as to what actually happened. She stated the multiple witnesses of this police confrontation with Aaron alleged that there were 2 shots fired, both from police, and that Aaron himself was unarmed and confused. She firmly believes that Aaron was killed in order for the military to pin what happened on him, despite the fact that other military officials were involved. Because of the numerous inconsistencies in the case, and how the military stonewalled the family at the beginning of the investigation, she believes that there is a bigger cover-up occurring. As to why Vanessa was murdered, we will never truly know. According to Cecily, Vanessa told Aaron while she was in the small arms repair room that she was going to call out the fact that Aaron and Cecily were together, despite her being married to Guillén. Aaron then decided to murder her in order to protect their relationship. However, most on the base knew that the pair was together, and Vanessa barely knew Robinson. making this motive incredibly unlikely. Vanessa was also not a confrontational person, so the chances that she would have antagonized Aaron in any way is nonsensical. Despite that, Cecily states that that's the reason Aaron gave to her. As it stands in 2022, Cecily Aguilar has been indicted on 11 counts involving her role covering up the death of Vanessa, and a trial date is still pending. Cecily, for her part, has tried to get the charges against her dropped, stating that she was just as much of a victim in these crimes as Vanessa. However, her blatant acknowledgement of the crimes on Instagram tells another story. Vanessa's murder was widely publicized, and to most, it's clear that without Vanessa's family pushing the military into action, it wouldn't have been investigated at all. Other cases like Vanessa's have been pushed aside and never fully investigated, with other missing soldiers' families never given the proper respect. Vanessa was one of 12 soldiers to go missing on Fort Hood, and her family was one of the only to get any sort of closure, due solely to their personal involvement. The Guillén family worked tirelessly to put Vanessa's face in the media and put pressure on Fort Hood to be more transparent, and that didn't end when her body was found. Because of that pressure, a full independent review was launched into Fort Hood and their practices, and how someone could kill on their base without anyone noticing. The outcome of that review led to 14 high-ranking officials being suspended or outright fired. However, how transformative this report will actually be remains to be seen, given that the official who was said to have taken part in the on-base prostitution ring still works there according to his own LinkedIn page. Hopefully, one day, this story will make sense, and more of the facts will come out. But as it stands now, it doesn't. How was a man able to kill someone so brutally in a military base without anyone seeing? How was it that the room where Vanessa died in had no evidence of her death just hours later? Why were there multiple false witnesses in this crime? How were new witnesses found months later after the initial crime? And why were they not spoken with sooner? None of it makes any sense, and chances are we will never get the answers we desire. Thank you for watching this episode of Dreading. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. If you want to support the channel, check us out on Patreon, which will be linked below. And remember, stay safe.